What you're about to experience is one man's quest to see beyond the tumultuous period we're in and to envision what lies just beyond our grasp, yet well within our reach. Welcome to Larry Rifkin's America Trends, where the future has arrived, and it's just in time.
Welcome back to America Trends. John Kropsic and Larry Rifkin. And John, this is the moment, this is the episode you and I have been waiting our entire lifetimes to do.
That's right. We actually had a trends guy.
I know. Now, we thought we were really trends guys, but we found the true original, almost like finding Colonel Sanders, you know, when you're going into KFC, and the real one. See, now they all have these imposters doing all these commercials as if they're, you know, the Colonel. But there was only one Colonel.
That's right. He's probably pumping gas with Elvis in Tennessee somewhere.
I think so. Well, Gerald Celente is the real deal. He is the publisher of the TrendsJournal and a remarkable guy who has really established trends as something not just where you have a crystal ball or you're a soothsayer or what have you, but a guy who developed this methodology, John, called Globalnomics to identify, to track, to forecast, and manage trends. So he's really serious about looking at what's ahead for us.
You know, we got to come up with some type of...
some methodology that we can claim as our own.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I said to him, we're kind of guys who look at trends from the rear view. In other words, we see something that is demonstrably a trend, and then we grab a hold of it. We don't project what's going to be a trend. We never would take that kind of risk. So we look at other sources. But Gerald really is fascinating, and he's so much fun to talk to, John.
He was a good guy to talk to.
Oh, my goodness. We had a ball with him, and you're going to hear it in just a moment, because he's going to be talking about what's ahead. Most importantly, about the economy in this particular year, 2019. And he tells us with some foreboding that the signs are a little bit ominous, lots of clouds overhead. So we've got to take that seriously.
Things could change depending on what people do. So.
Is that the wiggle room?
So there's a little wiggle there, which is good. So
well, let's wiggle around.
We need a little positive with our negative.
Absolutely. Well, we're going to wiggle around with him. Sounds like a battery. But anyway, we're going to wiggle with Gerald Celente. And again, you've got to find this guy because he is remarkable. And he's got, again, this Trends Research Institute. He's built his own methodology, and he's got this wonderful magazine, the TrendsJournal. Well, he'll tell us more about all of that in just a moment, right here on our own America Trends. On the line with us is Gerald Celente. And Gerald, you've been in this business of trend forecasting for a long time. We call ourselves America Trends, but we look at social and political changes in the country after the fact. What's it like to predict what's going to happen?
Well, you really can't predict it. There are too many wild cards, but you can see it pretty good. Like, for example, you know, I had forecast things like the 1987 market crash and the dot-com crash and the panic of '08. And I thought the markets would collapse and we go into a severe recession/depression in 2012. But they dealt wild cards, like things called zero interest rate policy and negative interest rate policy and quantitative easing. So, you know, that changed the whole game. And that's what's changing the game now. And that's one of our top trends, and we're calling it economic 9/11. The only thing that's propped up the markets is cheap money. It hasn't filtered through the economy in the broadest sense. And the fact that since 2009, for example, over 90% of the jobs that have been created are part-time, temporary work. And when you look at the tax cuts, for example, that Trump gave, you're seeing the vast majority, the numbers are coming out now. It didn't go into capital improvements. It went into stock buybacks. So the cheap money's been fueling the equity markets more than the global economy, and it's also boosted real estate prices because mortgage rates are very low. So now with interest rates going up and money tightening up around the world, we're looking at a severe downturn unless, and you can't predict this, unless the Fed does not raise interest rates aggressively in 2019, and if they lower them.
So when you are forecasting or looking forward, there's always that trap door. I mean, some policy change or some change that you can't anticipate could occur, but you do see an economic 9/11 in the year 2019.
As it's forming now. But again, if the Fed, you go back to September, it was a guarantee that the Fed was going to raise interest rates not only in December, but 3 to 4 times in 2019. Now that story's rapidly changed. So again, we definitely see an economic downturn. And here is the prime indicator that everyone could look at: housing sales. And you're seeing a slowdown now across the board, whether it's in new mortgages, refinancing, new home sales, existing home sales. You're seeing a broad slowdown in the sense that the market can't take a 5% 30-year mortgage. So if it goes back to those kind of levels, and we've seen it drop down a little bit, but the Fed just raised interest rates, so it looks like mortgage rates will go up again. So when we see that, we're looking at what we're calling a stage 1 recession. And then we take a trip around the world. You have Japan. Despite negative interest rates, 10-year bond yield, you buy the bond 10 years, you get less money than you paid for it. And they just saw their GDP the third quarter drop 2.5%. China's in a big slowdown. Retail sales are at a 15-year low. People have invested money in these scams, these peer-to-peer savings, where they promised these people that were doing the savings, promised them high interest rates, and they're collapsing like crazy. Auto sales in China, the worst performance since the 1990s, the biggest downturn. So we have a global slowdown, Europe as well. So it all depends on whether or not the central banks, and we can't predict this, keep putting in that monetary meth to keep pumping up the bull.
And when we look at Europe, I mean, it's not in great shakes itself. And now, of course, with all the uncertainty related to Brexit. So how do you look at Europe in relation to this world economic scene?
Europe is in deep trouble because they can't lower interest rates. They have negative interest rates already. Where do you go? Negative, And they also cut out their quantitative easing this past month. So they're going to have to, they said they're not going to do any more quantitative easing. We're looking at Italy slumping into a recession. Bank stocks are crashing all across Europe. I mean, the whole banking sector in Europe is down over 25%. And then you look at what's going on in France, the yellow vests, the protest about the people not having jobs, can't make enough money when they're working, and all they do is keep increasing taxes, not only in France, across Europe. And you're seeing more and more protests. So we're going to see the big things to look at outside the States are what's going on overseas. Europe, Japan, and China are the 3 big ones to look at, and they're not in good financial shape at all. So we think we are very close. We are at an economic 9/11, and we made that forecast, by the way, 2 days before the markets peaked. We made it in September of 2018. This S&P 500 peaked on September 21st. So we did it when the markets were going up, and we see more downward pressure, even though there's a spike now in the markets. This is highly manipulated as we see it. This is not a conspiracy theory. What you're looking at, it's the end of the month, very, very light trading going on, and you're noticing the market zooming up in the last hour. And we heard Mnuchin last week, the Treasury Secretary, talking to the banks and talking about the plunge protection team. Plunge protection team? How about rigging the market team? And that's what we look at now.
Well,
and by the way, that could have a positive effect for a couple of months, a month or so. It boosts it, it makes it look good, and it suckers more people back
Sure.
in.
They call it the dead cat bounce at other times. What about the political uncertainty in 2019 as it relates to Donald Trump? And of course, he is going to be desperate to make certain that one of the policies that he could point to as evidence of an administration that's functioning was the economy. How desperate is he going to be for a political win against the backdrop of all the problems he has legally and politically at this moment?
Well, one of the things he did, for example, and we had forecast this was going to happen before the midterm elections, and again, we're political atheists. We don't take sides on these things. I do make it very clear I do take a side on going to war. I launched Occupy Peace, so I want to make that very clear. Having said that, we had forecast in our TrendsJournal back in September that he would pull out of Syria and start serious peace talks with Afghanistan. And then we found out that he did it just recently because he was under pressure from Mattis, who he fired, not to do it before the elections. So he'll do that kind of thing, we believe, to get the people's mind off a declining economy, because all the data that's coming out now is that the tax cuts that Trump gave, and again, 82% of them, according to the Tax Policy Center, went to the 1%, and most of the money that was repatriated in tax breaks by bringing the money back home and from the tax cuts has gone into stock buybacks, which artificially drive up the market, and it's done to a tune this year estimated at $1 trillion. So that dries up stocks, because what they do is they buy them back. That's less shares on the market. Supply and demand pushes the price up artificially. So as we're going into 2019, there is a definite slowdown coming, and we're looking at growth to go back to Obama-era days of 2% GDP growth, 1.5 to 2%.
With your Globalnomic methodology, where you identify and you track and you forecast and manage various trends, what do you have on the board as it relates to this trade war and where this plays into some of the economic uncertainty that we're facing?
The trade war is not a war at all, and it's having a negative minor effect in China. All of Trump's tariffs on China account for the grand total of 0.7% of their GDP. The mainstream business media keeps pumping it up as tariffs is bringing down the market. It's not. We've been saying this, and by the way, we forecasted Trump rally in November of 2016. We said it was going to continue through 2017, and in 2018 we said this was the end of it. It was going to end this year. And the reason, again, being one reason only, the stop of monetary meth that artificially pumped up the markets. Again, in the history of the world, Part 1 and Part 2, there was no such thing as negative and zero interest rate policy, too big to fail banks, and quantitative easing. So when they're talking about the market's slowing down, they're blaming trade and tariff, and that's not it at all. As a matter of fact, when you look back at the amount of jobs America's lost from China since they came into the World Trade Organization in 2001, actually it was 2 weeks after 9/11 when no one was paying attention, we've lost 3.5 million jobs. China has a middle class now. 5% of their population was middle class back in 2000. Now, over 400 million people are middle class. In other words, they have a middle class bigger than the entire United States, plus probably another 100 million. It's like 450 million around there. So this isn't a trade war for China. It's because what China's done, and people don't understand the facts. When it was the United States corporations and European corporations that sold their countries out by getting manufacturing done in China. And here's the deal. Yeah, you could get all the stuff made over here that you want. We're a third world nation. We don't have any manufacturing facilities. You could set them all up over here. bring your technology, but you can't own the company. You got to come in with one of our partners. They call them SEOs,
Yeah.
State Enterprise Operations, but we'll put up a phony name and call it a company. Oh, and by the way, you can only own 49% of it. So what China's done is they have taken all of the technology from Europe and the United States, and they are going to be, their GDP when in the late 1990s was 11% of America's. In comparison, now it's 63, and in 5 years, China's GDP will be bigger than the United States. So when China's talking about a trade war, they're the ones really waging the war, and they're going to make a deal to keep it going. They're not going to give up a $375 billion merchandise trade surplus with the United States. Oh, and by the way, China's GDP, 80% of it's driven by consumer demand. In the United States, it's only between 2/3 and 70%. I bring that up for another reason. They can't purposely devalue their yuan, their currency, because they import so much product, and it'll cost them a lot more if their currency goes down. So that's how we look at the trade war issue. There'll be a negotiation on it, and it has nothing to do with bringing down the markets.
You look at human waves, I mean, the way that people are moving across the globe, and you say that with all that you see and the movements that will begin, there'll be more populist activity, more of our governments are going to be toppled, and a greater push toward nationalism. And we have seen a lot of those, on the left and the right, a lot of nationalistic, enterprises, regimes, governments come into play. How much more of an acceleration of this trend will we see?
This is just the beginning. And we look at the numbers. You go back to, about 100 years ago, we had about 1.6 billion people on the planet. So think about it. From the beginning of time to like 1916, 1915, took all that time to put, 1.6 billion people on the planet. We've added 6 billion plus in 100 years. Take a look down south of the border. Name the country: Argentina, Venezuela, Brazil. You look at Central America, Guatemala, Ecuador. One country after another. Nicaragua. Destabilization, violence, corrupt governments, no jobs. What are you going to do? You're going to escape. Take a look at the wars. The Iraq War, the Syrian War, the Libyan War, the Afghan War, the Yemen War. Bombs away over your country. You going to stay there? You take a look at Syria. Since the United States got involved there in 2011, over 600,000 people dead, 10 million displaced. Where are they going to go? Same thing with Iraq. Same thing with Yemen. And same thing with Libya. It's chaos and slaughter going on over there. So the people are escaping. Africa, same thing. Congo, Sudan, Somalia, South Africa. Look at their economy. They're in a recession. So you have billions and billions of people with no future, and their lives threatened. They're going to do anything they can to escape. On the other end, you're going to see more and more countries saying, no, we want to keep our country with our nationality, and we don't want you in here, and we don't have the jobs for you, and we don't accept your culture. You're seeing that in Hungary, you're seeing it in Austria, you're seeing it in Poland, you're seeing it in the Czech Republic, and you're going to see it more and more. And even in Italy, it's starting to happen now with the Five-Star Movement and League, the new parties that overthrew the establishment parties back in March.
So what are the implications? It sounds like a lot of safety valves are kind of coming off, and a lot of pressure that has built up over these concerns, and this growth of population is going to result in a lot of dysfunction and perhaps violence within and outside of these countries. So what do you see there?
What we see in a lot of ways is when we're looking at the economy and the anti-globalization, the building of nationalism. And again, we're not saying what's good or bad. We're just saying these are what's going on. This feels a lot like, to me, in reading back in history, and we were in the 1930s. That's the way it looks like. And the 1940s wasn't a happy time. So we see that building and building more and more.
Well, as we look at it, when we think back, and John F. Kennedy years later wrote a book, Why England Slept, Why America Slept. Is that something that we might be talking about going forward as we look at what's going on in this period?
I think what we're looking at is, again, you can see it in front of everybody's eyes. What's going on in France with the yellow vests. And by the way, do you know why all those people are wearing yellow vests?
Explain.
The government makes them buy them to put them in their car. And so that's why they all have them. And they're tired of the government telling them what to do at every level and raising taxes, as Macron, the president, had give big tax breaks to the wealthiest. So what we're looking at is that you're also seeing an influx of a lot of cheap labor. And that's why, by the way, one of the reasons why wages have been stagnant. They've only gone up a little bit this year, when really accounting for full inflation. They're down and have been down, and they're down around the world. So what happens is, as more cheap labor comes in, you start seeing more and more of these protests going on because people's taxes are going up for a variety of reasons. Oh, and we're going to have one of those happen here in America. Look at talking about interest rates. Look at the global debt burden. I mean, this year it just went up. We're over, $22 trillion worth of debt? There's interest on that debt you have to pay. As interest rates go up, that debt burden gets heavier. Multiply that around the world, you have a $250 trillion debt bubble ready to explode. So
Okay.
we see a lot of problems coming as countries are trying to deal with this, and they're going to blame everybody but themselves.
Gerald Celente is our guest on America Trends. He, of course, runs the Trends Research Institute and, of course, publishes TrendsJournal. And, Gerald, you've been phenomenal today. Just a couple of other areas that I'd like to explore with you. You say bye-bye boomers. Now, many of us are baby boomers, and we're wondering what the impact of our retiring is on our society. And you say that this trend is about to unleash the golden years for millions of seniors in 2019 will be marked by how to survive rather than how to thrive.
Well, some will thrive, but most are going to have a very difficult time. The debt levels are extremely high among boomers. 23% of men and 15% of women aged 65 and older is still in the labor force, and these are going to rise again to 27% and 20% respectively in 2020. Now, think back, when we were kids, people were retiring at 62, 65, and you can't do that anymore. You're having 32% of boomers are cohabitating. They're living with one or more people because they can't make ends meet. Then you look at how unhealthy the boomers are. 25% of Americans over the age of 65 have been diagnosed with diabetes. 70% of boomers are overweight, and nearly 40% are clinically obese. And those numbers are actually higher because they keep changing them. So what we have is a medical and financial crisis in front of us. I just turned 72, and one of the lines I came up with is that the older you get, the more you have to do. And if you don't do it, the less you do, the quicker you go. And,
well, that's a
I try
point.
to do the best I can. I don't want to end up as an inmate in a nursing home. And when I see what's going on with society, it's up to the individual really to take care of themselves. And again, when we're looking at the boomers, we had, again, more than 100,000 of the 800,000 annual bankruptcy filings are from households headed by seniors in the United States. 52% of U.S. citizens in their 60s are either negatively supporting a parent or being supported by their offspring. That's the Pew Research Center. And again, one piece of data after another. So on the positive end, there's going to be a lot of on-trendpreneurs that see where this trend is going and are going to develop products and services to take care of the golden ages, both negatively and positively, in the sense that there's whole health healing alternatives that can improve lifestyle of golden ages, and there's also the ones where you're going to have to come up with ideas and suggestions on how to take care of them, feed them, house them, and there's going to be new medical advances and technological ones.
Well, the boomers
that
would
people are gonna
seem
take
not to
advantage
want to go lightly and gently into the night when you look at how our generation thought that it had changed the world back in the 60s and 70s. But you remind us that this on-trendpreneurs is also looking at not only those who are senior having a real problem with obesity, but everyone in our culture. And you suggest that in the year 2019, a lot of people are going to become more obese.
Again, look at the data. You go back to the 60s. The obesity rate was around 4%, and now you're looking at 40% just among the boomers. When we were kids in school, there were one or two very heavy kids, and now the schools are filled up with them. And it's very simple. Look what they're eating. You are what you eat in so many different ways. And the cost of obesity, by the way, is staggering as well when you look at the numbers. And they're all in the TrendsJournal report. Milken Institute did a big study on it. Now, this is really, when you look at the aging boomers and when you look at the what we call the trend ready to explode, this is going to have devastating cost effects on the economy, particularly in the medical field. And there's very little being done about it, and not a lot even talked about it. Because if you talk about it, it comes in with one of our other trends, Puritan America. America Puritan 2.0. You start talking about it, and then you get attacked by the people that talk about fat pride. And again, we have a story, part of the story in there that they say, there's nothing wrong with being well overweight. And I'll just read you quickly that the Milken Institute released a study, Americans' Obesity Crisis, the Health and Economic Costs. In 2016, chronic disease driven by the risk factor of obesity and overweight accounted for $480.7 billion in direct health costs in the U.S., with an additional $1.24 trillion in indirect costs due to lost economic productivity.
Yeah.
It's astounding.
No, remarkable stuff. At the same time, you tell us that, maybe boomers are going to be meeting on the other side, the opportunity where they started with, drugs back in the 60s. They're going to be able to get high and get healthy through the cannabis industry. Is that one of the big trends of 2019?
I got to tell you, that's one of the biggest. This is like we write, you're waking up, it's 1933, and they just lifted prohibition. You want to get in the alcohol business? That's where we're at over here, but even bigger, because it's bigger than alcohol. You only drink alcohol. And it's more than marijuana, it's cannabis and all of the medical benefits of it. I mean, as we point out, if the planet could feed us, could it heal us? I mean, they've been using cannabis and marijuana and extracts from hemp for healing qualities since the beginning of time. And now that time has come again. And it's countries all over the world. Just this week, Thailand, they have really restrictive drug laws over there. They just legalized medical marijuana. It's going on all over the world. And now Trump just signed that bill, the farm bill, that's legalizing hemp. That it was illegal was a joke to begin with. But now think of all the industrial use that will come out of that. That's going to replace things like plastic and others. This is probably one of the biggest profit trends that we see developing in the years to come. And it's trends are born, they grow, they mature, reach old age, and die. This one's just been born. Here in New York, we had Cuomo coming out talking about, well, we're going to do it because, we don't want the disadvantaged people to have been subjected to all that unfair legal. Nah, come on, stop the BS. You're doing it for taxes. And you want the money, just like they did with alcohol. Who are you talking to? What am I, 6 years old? That's why they're legalizing it all over the world and all over the country. They want tax revenue from it. That's why the politicians are doing it. Colorado is bringing in more tax revenue from marijuana than they are booze, and it's only a few years old.
Gerald, you've been a delight. Before we leave, you talk about something that's just beginning to boomlet. What about dying brands? We're talking to you on a day when Sears may liquidate. What else are we looking at in terms of dying brands as a trend?
This is a trend that we came out with. In our TrendsJournal back in the late 1990s, we mentioned places like Campbell's Soup and Sears and J.C. Penney and Kmart. We said they're gone. They're leaving because they haven't changed with the new millennium. And so many of the retailers haven't. It's more than just online, which of course is taking a big chunk away from them. But they all became the same. There used to be one time when you went into places, they had style to them. They all became nothing. They all began. I remember when the warehouses started. Isn't it great going shopping in a warehouse? It's like going into a large self-storage unit. Isn't it wonderful? Really wants to make you feel great. And that's what happened with so many of these retailers. You go to one, you go to them all. And they had no individuality to them. And again, being a boomer and an older guy, I remember when there were 3 Macy's, one up in Yonkers, one up down in Herald Square, and one out in Long Island. And then they became everywhere, and they all looked the same. And it's one after another. So for the dying brands to change, they have to rebrand. They have to get in step with the times, and that means developing a whole new look, a whole new style, and not all the same.
Well, I thank you so much for coming by today and helping us peer through whatever crystal ball we may all have as to the future that looks ahead here in 2019. And you've been forecasting worldwide since 1980. Gerald, let people know about the various products that you have, the TrendsJournal, and where they can find some of this great information.
Well, they could go to TrendsJournal.com, TrendsJournal.com. We have a monthly magazine. And we also have trend alerts that we sent out each week, at least each week. If there's more needed, we send those out. We do Trends in the News broadcasts every Monday through Thursday. And guaranteed, money-back guarantee, it's the only place you will read history before it happens. For example, here you are, Larry, we're talking about the future. Pick up any of the newspapers, go to any of the TV stations. The review of 2018. Yeah, big deal. We passed that already. What's coming up?
Well, you are great. We'd love to have you back on America Trends. Thank you for allowing us to kind of tread in an area that you have sown so beautifully over the years and really made a delight to understand more about because of the way you approach this in a very analytical way, using methodology that you yourself developed. And if you want to talk about that for a moment, because somebody might be listening to you saying, this guy sounds so knowledgeable, what should I take away from him? And you've really done this in a very, very methodical, empirical way. Describe that.
Well, when I was a little boy, my father, may his soul rest in peace, I'd shoot my mouth off, and they'd look at me, and in Italian, he'd say to me, "Pappagallo, parrot, stop repeating what everybody else is saying and think for yourself." He said that enough to me where I realized before I speak, I better have the facts. And I better not repeat what everyone else is saying just because everyone else is saying it. And that was really the foundation. And the other one, as I said, I'm a political atheist. I began my career at a graduate school. I was the number 2 guy running the mayoral campaign in Yonkers, New York. I was the assistant to the secretary of the New York State Senate, designed and instructed American politics and campaign technology at St. John's University. And I was a chief government affairs specialist for the chemical industry back in the 70s in D.C. So I've been on the other side. I have pictures with me and Reagan. I've been with princes, prime ministers, and I know what it looks like. And so I have that aspect of government that's really nothing more than the people that run it are the same people you couldn't stand in high school and college that wanted to be class president and head of the student council. So if anybody believes in their political party and their political agenda, they're not waking up to the future. They're caught in a trap, and rather than believing in themselves, they're believing in other people.
Well, you're better than any cup of coffee, waking us up to what's going to be happening ahead. Thank you so much, Gerald, for being with us today on America Trends.
And thank you so much for having me.